Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to my video podcast on the future of business and technology. And today's topic is the impact of generative AI, and in particular, the mindset needed to fully embrace it. And to help me discuss this, I'm pleased to say I'm joined today by Andrew McAfee, who is a principal research scientist at MIT, head of the MIT's initiative on the digital economy, and he was recently appointed as the inaugural and only visiting fellow in technology and society at Google. Welcome, Andy.
Bernard, thank you for having me.
It's such a pleasure. Where are you joining us from today?
I am joining you from an island off the coast of Massachusetts that luckily has very good bandwidth.
Very good, very good. So you have written numerous books, and you have a new book coming up, which is called The Geek Way, the radical mindset that drives extraordinary results, which we will dive into later. Maybe you can give everyone a bit of your background. Your work at the MIT's initiative on the digital economy is renowned. Maybe a little rundown on your background and your current work would be really useful.
I have spent, it's almost 30 years now at business schools in the US trying to understand where all of this technology is taking us. And that started off at Harvard Business School, where I did my doctorate, and then I taught for about a decade. And then I came back to MIT because it turns out I was an undergraduate at MIT in the 1980s. And I came back to MIT to the business school in 2009 to continue this long journey of trying to figure out where this amazing, continually evolving toolkit of technologies is taking the business world and taking the entire world.
Very good. And so what does your normal day involve today? What do you do in your current job?
Well, right now, like you know, I am promoting my book, The Geek Way. So there's a lot of writing to do that. There are interviews. I am active on social media. So in the ramp up to a book, an author spends a lot of time getting ready for that. But normally I write the next book is the short way to say. When I'm not traveling, I'm usually trying to work on a book project.
Very good. And what is your take on generative AI, and in particular the impact it is having and will have on the world?
I'm right in mainstream economists' opinion about generative AI, which is that it is a big deal because economists have come up with, I don't know if it's a test, but a set of criteria for figuring out if a given technology is going to have a large economic impact. And once in a while, a technology comes along that is so powerful and so broadly applicable that it accelerates the normal march of economic progress. And like a lot of economists, I believe that generative AI belongs in that category. And these are called general purpose technologies, and they have three characteristics. In other words, we don't only know that something is a general purpose technology by looking backward. We can look at it in the moment and make a pretty good guess about whether or not it's going to have a very large impact. So economists look for three things. The first one is this technology itself improving very quickly? And with that, the answer is clearly yes with generative AI. The second question is it diffusing widely? Is it going to be used just in one industry, in one sector of the economy, or is it going to be used very broadly? And again, the answer is it's going to be used pretty broadly. We can talk about that. The third one is it spawning all kinds of complementary innovations? Are people using it in conjunction with other tools and technologies to do interesting things? And there again, I think the answer is clearly already yes. And keep in mind, this is still a very young technology. So when we look at generative AI and we say it's improving rapidly, it's diffusing rapidly, and it's already generating lots of complementary innovations, then the mainstream economic opinion is this thing is a general purpose technology and we should expect it to have a large economic impact. And I think that's true. The technological impact that most economists would look at first is just good old-fashioned productivity. Is this thing going to increase productivity? I think the answer to that is clearly yes, but I also think that's too narrow a way to look at it. And generative AI is going to improve creativity. It's going to improve access to very powerful technologies. It's going to bring us into a generation of technology that is easier and less frustrating to use. So I'm hugely excited to see where this particular technology takes us.
So what are some of your favorite examples that you've seen that really open our eyes to the potential of generative AI in the world today?
One of them is work that is going on in a few different places, and this is in the category of complementary innovations to combine generative AI with real world or entities that move through the physical world, a robot, for example, because science fiction is us talking to a robot that realizes what we want and then goes and executes our wishes. Okay, we're actually close to that with generative AI in a couple different ways. First of all, we interact with generative AI via language, and it's already very, very good at understanding what you and I are saying and extracting intent or extracting meaning from it. So if I go say, pick up the yellow ball, right now, generative AI kind of realizes what my intention is there. Now, the interesting part is marrying that to a piece of physical machinery that can look around, sense the environment, figure out that there's a yellow ball, move to it, pick that thing up, and bring it back to me. All of that is difficult, but all of that got one big step easier with the advent of the Gen AI toolkit. So that's one example of a complementary innovation. Another more broad, more abstract one is the reason generative AI works so well is it takes this incredibly complicated, super multidimensional thing called human language and mathematizes it in a useful way. And people talk about the latent space of language that Gen AI has a representation of and then puts that representation to use. Now, language is not the only insanely complicated, multidimensional, combinatorial thing out there. Another thing that has that characteristic is the universe of proteins out there. And so there's a lot of work going on to try to apply foundation models to this universe of proteins and mathematize them in a useful way. One really intriguing possibility there is maybe we will no longer be limited by the proteins that are available to us today in nature. The proteins that exist on the planet Earth are a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of all the possible proteins out there. These are very large, very complicated molecules. Maybe we now have a way to design and hopefully even manufacture proteins that are not found in nature, proteins that can do the things that we want them to do. Now, it's early days, but that's the kind of thing that I get very excited about.
Yeah, especially the potential transformative impact on healthcare this could have. I completely agree. So when you look at the different sectors and different professions, where do you anticipate the most impact of generative AI? And which ones do you think will be most resistant to any impact or change?
Luckily, you don't have to rely on my opinion on this topic. My co-founder and colleague, Daniel Rock, along with a team of colleagues, tried to answer exactly your question, Bernard. And they took a really interesting approach. They looked at all of the tasks that are done in the United States economy, or any rich world country's economy. And then they asked a team of experts, and they also asked generative AI itself, can this task have its productivity at least doubled by generative AI? And it turns out the human raters and the large language model itself agreed very, very closely on the answer to this question. They then rolled that up because a job is composed of tasks, an industry is composed of jobs, and you can kind of take this approach and apply it anywhere. And their conclusions are pretty striking. They said about 20%, about half of the US workforce has at least 10% of its tasks that are amenable to big productivity boosts from generative AI. That's pretty remarkable. About 20% of the US workforce has fully half of its tasks amenable to big productivity gains from generative AI. And these are, like you could imagine, the most language intensive jobs out there. A programmer is a pretty good example. Programming languages are hugely boosted, or your ability to code is hugely boosted already by generative AI. That's only going to get better. You can think of other professions that do a lot of work with language, with patterns. Right now, the jobs and the tasks that are least amenable to these big productivity boosts are jobs that are primarily in the physical world. Janitor right now is not a job that looks like it's greatly exposed to generative AI. But again, we have to stay tuned. The innovators are going to be combining generative AI with floor mopping robots, and who knows what we'll get down the road. But right now, those estimates are the best ones that we have. And it appears that the sweet spot for productivity boosts via generative AI is actually a little bit higher on the wage ladder, the skill ladder, the education ladder than has been the case for previous digital technologies. So lawyer is a pretty high paid, high educated job right now. A lot of what a lawyer does, not arguing in front of a jury and a judge, but a lot of what a lot of lawyers do is pretty clearly amenable to Gen AI.
Yeah, I completely agree. What do you see as some of the risks that we need to mitigate in order to really leverage generative AI? Because there are concerns about hallucinations, there are
Yeah.
concerns around biases. This is stopping many organizations really adopting this technology. And regulation is another challenge. How do we, what do you think are the biggest risks that we need to tackle?
And the first thing to keep in mind is that every powerful technology brings drawbacks along with it. There's just no such thing as a technology that's nothing but beneficial to everybody involved. So it's not new that we have a powerful technology that has some risks with it. Now, generative AI is weird, right? Because as you point out, it does hallucinate. It very confidently says things that are not true. And that turns out to be a tough problem to solve. It's down deep in the way the technology works. I can guarantee you that technology producers and companies that build Gen AI systems are keenly aware of this, and they're working like crazy to minimize the hallucination or combine Gen AI with other kinds of systems that are more fact-based, where the factuality is higher, to try to address that problem. There are also always problems with bias, or the risk of bias, especially with artificial intelligence and machine learning systems. Again, the vendors are very, very keenly aware of this. With generative AI, some of the current systems appear to have been trained on copyrighted materials, and copyright holders are upset about that. But there's a new generation of tools that asserts and that warrants that they were not trained on copyrighted materials. The new image generative AI from Adobe, for example, says this was not trained on any copyrighted images. That's not a risk that you have. So in general, when I look at the risks, and we should be clear, there are risks with Gen AI. That's not unusual. They are manageable, and I haven't seen any that would encourage me to tell a company, to tell an executive team, don't do this technology yet. It's too risky. I don't believe that. I believe it's time to go.
Yeah, I agree. So, in your upcoming book, The Geek Way, you discuss how innovators are leveraging technologies like Gen AI. And thank you very much for giving me an advance copy of it. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Maybe you can share a sneak peek of the book and give us an overview of what's in it.
Let me start by explaining why I wrote the book. I wrote it because for my whole career, I've kind of spent time with one foot in each economy. I spend a lot of time, and I don't like these terms, old economy and new economy, but we kind of know loosely what they mean. I spent a lot of time looking around old economy companies and how they're trying to use technology. And I spent a lot of time inside new economy companies, a lot of time in Silicon Valley, looking at what companies that produce technology do. And they always felt very, very different to me. Those two kinds of companies just felt different. And over time, the differences grew instead of shrinking in my brain. And also over time, those new economy companies started disrupting the old economy in industry after industry, whether we're talking about advertising or retail or print journalism or consumer electronics, or now these days, cars. That style of company that was concentrated in Northern California, this is disrupting sector after sector all throughout the global economy. And I got very interested in that. And I tried to figure out what was going on, what was at the heart of this disruption phenomenon. And my answer is contained in the book, The Geek Way. And my answer is actually really straightforward. A bunch of geeks concentrated in Northern California, but not only found there, have given the company an upgrade. And I'm not trying to be cute. The company is a technology. The company is a thing that we human beings invented to help us accomplish our goals. That's a technology. The geeks have upgraded that technology. And they didn't do it by installing some super secret AI system. They did it by iterating and experimenting their way into a healthier set of practices, into a smarter set of practices for getting important things done. A shorthand for that is culture. Culture discussions are always often very vague to me, but I'm talking about culture as the nuts and bolts of how you get things done in an organization. The geeks have upgraded that culture, and I call that new culture the Geek Way.
Mm. Very good. And you describe yourself as a young geek as well in the book. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, like a lot of us, and Bernard, you might be in this category too. As a kid, I was weirdly into these new things called computers. I was a little bit antisocial, and that's the classic definition of a geek. What I wanted to do is take that word and stake claim to it and broaden it out. So for me now, a geek is anybody who has two characteristics. Number one, they get obsessed with a hard problem and they really have trouble letting it go. They're just very, very tenacious and they're focused on a big, tough problem. Number two, if the solutions that they come up with to that problem are outside the mainstream or are unconventional, the geeks don't care. They will go be unconventional. Well outside the mainstream. The shorthand phrase that I use is obsessive mavericks as a quick definition for geek. I love this combination of quotes from Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, both of whom would pretty clearly qualify. Gates said in an interview a while back, he said, "Look, if geek means that you're willing to study something, then I plead guilty." And Bezos said in a shareholders letter a few years ago, "We are willing to be misunderstood for long periods of time." So I combine those two together. And for me, a geek is now an obsessive maverick. The geeks that I wrote about, there were wine geeks and Star Trek geeks and all kinds of geeks out there. The geeks that I wrote about were what I call the business geeks. They got obsessed with this problem of how do I run and grow a company and keep it lean, keep it agile, keep it innovative, maintain its ability to execute, even as the company grows and gets pretty big. Those are the geeks that I got obsessed with and that I started to write about.
Very good. And in the book, you've defined 4 norms that encapsulate the geek way. Can you outline those and maybe explain why these particular norms stand out for you?
Yeah. So, what is the geek way? What is this new culture that I think works so well? And I think the evidence kind of backs that up to solidify why there's an interesting phenomenon going on here. I didn't realize as I was starting to research the book, but 1/3 of all of the market capitalization gains across all public American companies in the 21st century have come from Northern California, have come from that tiny, tiny piece of real estate. I already listed a bunch of the industries that have been disrupted, and there's more of that coming from this same small piece of real estate and the people who started their careers there. So there is something going on. And I boiled it down to 4 norms. And I think norm is the right word, because a norm is something that the people around you expect out of you. And that's extremely powerful. They're expected behaviors, not by the boss, not just by the boss. And whether or not it's written down in the employee handbook is a separate topic. Norms are the way things actually get done in a company or in any organization. And because we humans are so attuned to peer pressure and to what people around us are doing, norms are incredibly powerful and sticky. So the Geek Way consists of 4 of them. And they are speed, by which I mean iterating and getting feedback at a fast cadence; ownership, pushing authority and responsibility down, often to uncomfortable levels, and reducing the amount of coordination required; science, which means arguing about evidence. I love this notion of the scientific method as an ongoing argument with the ground rule that the winner is the person whose argument is best supported by the available evidence. So for me, science is an evidence-based argument. And then finally, openness, which is pretty close to the concept of psychological safety. Are you willing to speak out? On the flip side, are you willing to take constructive criticism or take feedback from somebody wherever they are on the org chart and process it and respond to it? And it's close to the opposite of defensiveness. Are you a defensive person, or are you an open one? So for me, the Geek Way revolves around this combination of speed, ownership, science, and openness.
Very good. Another concept that you talk about in the book is creativity and its importance. How can we boost this in everyone?
Your organization, I don't care where you work, your organization is full of creative people. And one of my favorite questions to ask an executive is, think whatever the biggest challenges are in your organization. My question is, do you think there's somebody inside your organization who has a good answer to that challenge or a good way to address that challenge right now? And the answer is almost always yes, right? What I don't hear very often is, no, I think all my people don't have any idea what's going on, and I've got to hire a bunch of expensive consultants or outsiders because they're the only one who understand our situation. I've never heard that. So creativity is pretty broadly distributed, as is the knowledge that's necessary, as is the ability and the desire to innovate. I think a huge part of what the geeks have done, and a huge part of the reason the Geek Way works, is that they have built companies that actually get out of their own way and let the people inside the organization do what they want to do and do what they're capable of doing. And instead of this magic serum that increases everybody's IQ or creativity IQ by 25 points, I think instead what the geeks have done is figure out how to have organizations that don't decrease the IQ or creative ability of their people by 25 points or whatever.
And you talk about our human superpower of cooperation and rapid learning.
Yeah.
How can businesses tap into this more effectively?
And this starts from a really basic question. I tap into and I rely on findings from this field called cultural evolution. And my interpretation of that field is that it asks a really, really interesting question as its founding question. And that question is, why are we human beings the only species on the planet that builds spaceships? I mean, no one else is coming close. In sci-fi movies, the chimpanzees or the octopuses might build spaceships, but here on the actual planet Earth, none of us should be sitting around expecting that. This is weird, right? There's one species on the planet that accomplishes this category of thing. How do we do it? The naive initial answer is usually we're really intelligent. And we are, but that answer doesn't work for reasons I explain in the book. We're actually very dumb in a lot of ways. What we are is that we are more social than any other entity on the planet. And I mean that in two ways that get to your question. The first one is that we humans are the only species that cooperates intensely with large numbers of individuals who we are not related to. We humans come together in large crowds of strangers and build spaceships. Nothing else even comes close to that. The second thing that we do is we evolve our cultures. That's where the name cultural evolution comes from. We evolve our cultures very, very quickly. And a synonym for that is innovate or learn or advance. There's a wonderful quote from Steve Stewart Williams, who's a psychologist I included in the book, and he nails this point. He says, 10,000 years ago, the pinnacle of chimpanzee culture was sticking a twig into a termite mound to get termites out. Today, the pinnacle of chimpanzee culture is sticking a twig into a termite mound to get the termites out. Chimpanzees have culture. Their cultures don't evolve. Ours do. So in addition to the ability to cooperate very, very intensely, we don't just cooperate the same way, generation after generation. We advance. We cooperate differently. We learn. And so our human superpower, in addition to intense cooperative ability, is learning ability. And Bernard, in the world that you and I grew up in, we think of learning as a thing that happens in a classroom with a teacher at the front of the room. That's actually, I think, fundamentally the wrong way to look at it. Learning is a thing that happens among all of us all the time by observing the people around us, figuring out who's successful, who's prestigious. In other words, who should I learn from? And then creating kind of a blended average of all of those good models, and incorporating that blended average and maybe improving on it a tiny bit ourselves. We humans are the planet's great learners. And so one of the things that the business geeks have done is build companies that tap into both of those abilities and backstop the problems that come together when people come together and cooperate in large numbers.
And you suggest the Geek Way is non-traditional and somewhat counter to established business norms. What do you see as the most challenging aspect for traditional businesses when adopting the Geek Way?
I think all the norms that I talk about are a little bit unnatural for people. We do not like to be challenged. We do not like, especially in public, we do not like to have our ideas called out as wrong. And as we become more senior or more dominant is another way to say the same thing, as we rise up higher on the org chart or get more seniority, for a lot of us, that means I'm immune to those kinds of challenges. I don't have to put up with that anymore. And a dominant chimp absolutely does not put up with challenges. So being challenged is a uncomfortable and unpleasant experience for it. Science is unpleasant. I can tell you, I've been in plenty of seminars presenting my work where I would have traded places with anyone getting a root canal because the back and forth was just unpleasant. Science is hard. We don't want to do it, and it feels uncomfortable in some ways. Speed, this geek habit, this geek norm of iterating, is very unnatural because we humans want to sit around and plan, and we think we can plan out everything that needs to happen and deal with all the contingencies in advance, and we can't, and we're wrong about that. Danny Kahneman thinks it's so deeply rooted that he calls it the planning fallacy. Devolving authority, giving authority to other people, which is at the heart of the norm of ownership, that's also uncomfortable. We want it for ourselves. Human beings want to accumulate status and resources. Of course we do. The ownership is about giving that stuff to somebody else. And then finally, this idea of openness gets back to what I was talking about before. We human beings are defensive by nature. We want to protect what's ours. We want to get more. We don't want challenges. We don't want to be put on the spot, and we get defensive when that happens. The geek norm of openness is the opposite of that. So part of the reason that the Geek Way is difficult, it's not intellectually super difficult, but trying to get people to behave in these somewhat unintuitive, difficult ways, trying to get them to adopt these norms is not easy. However, the good news is once you get the norms in place, they can be sticky, and norms are community policing. They are a bit self-perpetuating. So once you get these things in place, you get the ball rolling. Think about an engineer at SpaceX who said, okay, everybody, for our next rocket, we're not going to build a lot of prototypes. We're just going to sit around the drawing board for a long time and make sure that we've got it right on paper before we go build anything in the physical world. That person wouldn't last very long at that organization because they have adopted the geek norm of speed. So once you've got the norms, they're sticky.
So you mentioned that part of the Geek Way is not being afraid of making mistakes.
Yeah.
Do you have any good examples that showcase this, that actually making a mistake can lead to better understanding and can lead to innovation?
Oh, over and over again. How else do you learn except by making mistakes? So think again about SpaceX, the way they have learned how to build commercially viable, reusable rockets. They are the only company, the only organization on the planet that builds commercially viable, reusable rockets. This is astonishing. SpaceX is, I believe, 21 years old. This is a baby in the space industry, and yet they've accomplished this very difficult thing. They are the only organization on the planet that could deploy thousands of rugged, reliable, high bandwidth satellite internet terminals to Ukraine after Russia invaded. These terminals work in a war zone. There's one company that could do that. I'll say it again. This company is about 20 years old. The rate of learning and innovation at this company is phenomenal. And when you learn anything about SpaceX, they're fanatics about this geek norm of speed, which again is not just about velocity, it's about iteration, cadence, and feedback. So I see examples like that all over the place. It's I see over and over these industrial era companies that just get flat, that just look like they're flat-footed, and the geeks race by them, and the incumbent is sometimes confused about how did this happen this quickly, what happened here. And the answer is the geeks have succeeded at this slogan that we've been kicking around in my world of business academia for a long time. We've been talking about the learning organization as long as I've been part of business academia. The geeks have built the world's fastest learning organizations. Watch out if you are their competitor.
So for larger and more established organizations, what steps can they take to integrate the Geek Way into their corporate culture without causing too much disruption?
There's going to be some disruption.
Mm.
And this is the case with any kind of big change effort, with any kind of organizational change. I got to interview a lot of my favorite geeks for the book, and I got to interview a couple new geeks. One of them was Satya Nadella, who's the CEO of Microsoft, obviously. And I think he has pulled off one of the great comeback stories in business history. You probably remember how dead in the water Microsoft was for the first decade of the 21st century. Their stock price was absolutely flat. They were going nowhere. They had stopped innovating. They were still a large company, large profitable company, but nobody was expecting anything out of Microsoft, and that was reflected in their stock price. When you looked inside the company, they had become a classic large sclerotic bureaucracy with a ton of infighting going on and a great ability to squash good ideas. Nadella comes in, I think he's been there less than 10 years now, and has unlocked astonishing amounts of value in that time. So I got to ask him about it. And I was listening to his answers, and they're in the book. I kept on saying, this is just the way a geek would go about it. He adopted agile practices. He tried to remove conflicting motivations and incentives and adopt this geek norm of ownership. And he has himself demonstrated this characteristic of openness and worked hard to make Microsoft a place where there's a bit more back and forth and a bit more psychological safety. So when I get asked the question, can the incumbents of the industrial era learn the geek way? My answer is yeah, I've seen it happen. I've seen this comeback happen. It's not easy. It's not overnight, but there's nothing in the DNA of an established company that makes it impossible to adopt the geek way.
What are the examples of organizations that have fully embraced the Geek Way throughout their entire organization?
One thing I didn't know that I learned when I was researching the book was that in its early days, Amazon was on the way to becoming a massive bureaucracy. It turns out that if you wanted to innovate at Amazon, if you had an idea for an innovation, you submitted it to a bureaucracy. It was called the NPI, the New Proposed Initiative or Innovation Process. And you wrote it up and you submitted it. It went through these cycles of approval. And if the committee liked it, they gave you a blessing. If they didn't like it, they said, no, thanks. The worst news was if you got a memo from the committee saying, we don't like any of your ideas, but you have to support this other idea over here that we do like. So you continue to be responsible for all your previous objectives. And now you have to go help somebody else in addition. This was not popular, like you can imagine, but it was the way Bezos wanted it. He thought innovation was so important that it had to be managed in this very rational, hierarchical way. People in the organization hated it. Bezos, at some point in the late 90s, realized that he was creating this top-heavy, sclerotic bureaucracy that was choking off innovation. And so he said, okay, we're not doing that. We're going to do something different. And what they did was this 180-degree pivot where instead of a norm of process and hierarchy and tons of structure, they instead threw that out as much as they could and embraced the great geek norm of ownership. And Amazon today is a very, very modular organization composed of small, pretty decentralized teams that are working on their particular project, but they don't have to ask for resources from the technology department. That was the whole decoupling project that they did that led in large part to Amazon Web Services, that was instrumental to the birth of the cloud, was an internal effort to make the technology so accessible and modularizable that you didn't need to ask anyone's permission to use it. And then they worked on organizational equivalents of that. And so by the standards of gigantic corporations today, Amazon has comparatively huge levels of autonomy, empowerment, responsibility, all of these things around the great geek norm of ownership. But the company did not start this way. So it's possible to make that 180-degree pivot.
Excellent. So if there was one thing you wanted anyone listening or watching this to take away from your book and implement immediately, what would this be?
It would just be the general idea that there is an upgrade available out there. There is a way to get geeky, and it's available to you. The one thing you can start doing as a leader in an organization, or a leader of a team, a leader at any level in an organization, is start modeling the behaviors, the norms that you want to see out there. Because it turns out another very fundamental aspect of being a human being is that we are mimics. We don't even realize the extent to which we mimic the senior people around us. So if you want the geek way to spread, start being geeky yourself.
Very good bit of advice. Looking 10 years down the road, how do you envision the landscape of business, technology, and our daily life to be altered by technologies like generative AI?
That's an almost impossible question for me to answer. And I want to be kind of humble about that, because Gen AI is so new and it's improving so quickly and being combined with other innovations so quickly that 10 years out, I think my imagination is actually insufficient for that question. What I can tell you is that some things are going to be quite different. And hopefully, the amount of creativity has been unlocked and the amount of drudgery of clerk work has gone down. I was talking a bunch of years back with Carl Bass, who was at that time the CEO of Autodesk, the computer-aided design software company. And he had this insight that stuck with me. He said, look, we ask people to be clerks to computers. We ask them to format everything and do all this little detail work to try to get to the goal that we want. One of the things I'm hopeful about with Gen AI is that it's going to get us out of the clerk business and get us into interacting with tools in a more intuitive way and having to do less of the stupid busy work that goes along with working with technology right now. Here's a prediction that I want to be wrong about. I think that in 10 years, the incumbents of the industrial era are going to be in a worse place than they are today, because the geeks are coming. The geeks are coming to many, many different industries. And I think because the geek way works better, it's going to win out in a lot of competitive battles. Now, like I said, I want to be wrong about that. And what the way I want to be wrong is for the incumbents of the industrial era to realize the nature of the threat that they face and become like Satya Nadella at Microsoft and lead this flavor of rejuvenation, of turnaround in their organization that will make them more agile, more innovative, better able to execute. The tools are available out there. I don't think it's a mystery anymore. I'm very eager to see if the incumbents can mount any comeback in as the geeks continue their advance.
Yeah, some organizations will manage this very well, but I share your concern that many of them probably won't.
Yeah.
The two questions I ask all my guests about the future is, what are you most excited about and what are you most concerned about? So maybe we can start with the concerned part. What about the future are you most concerned or worried about?
In America and a lot of other countries, the amount of polarization in our society is increasing. We are a deeply tribal species, and that tribalism is becoming more and more evident. And it's making us less able to talk to each other, to come together, to have consensus, to govern well. And I don't see this polarization slowing down or reversing course. And the things that I read leave me unsettled, because the pattern from history is that this kind of polarization can continue until there's a pretty bad precipitating event. So the thing that worries me most is we're losing our ability to talk effectively to each other. Because we're losing our desire to talk effectively to each other. This polarization is extremely scary to me.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's hugely scary, and generative AI can actually boost this polarization to some extent because it can just create more content, autonomously misleading content, misinformation that will make this problem potentially worse. Yes, very, very big problem. What about the future are you most excited about?
I'm a mindful technology optimist. I think that take this tool that we have right now of generative AI, and the way I think about it is putting very, very powerful tools in the hands of many more people around the world. It's going to give them an ability to express their creativity. It's going to reduce the amount of drudgery that they have to go through to use technology. I'm excited by that development. And we talked earlier about the risks. Of course, there are risks and downsides, but I think that the human history of dealing with technology is an encouraging history. Has not been perfect, but we're still here. There are more of us. We are more affluent than we have been in the past. The old joke among economists is that technological progress is the only free lunch that we do believe in. We're getting a lot of free lunch served to us these days, and I'm really excited to see what the innovators and the creative minds out there do with this technology over the next 10 years.
Very good. For anyone who ever wants to rewatch or re-listen to this conversation, simply head to my podcast or my YouTube channel, where you can find this conversation and hundreds other conversations like this. Thank you so much, Andy, for your time today. That was super interesting. I keep going with this forever. I'm sure we can do this again another point, maybe when your next book is out.
I hope so. I look forward to it. Thanks for a great conversation.
Yes, likewise. And anyone, I can fully recommend the Geek Way to anyone. I think it's a super interesting read, and it will hopefully help some of the incumbent organizations not to become redundant by the geeks. So thank you so much.
Good. Thank you.